Hello everybody. In my last video, I went over the fact that the people who agree with us, who are on our side of a certain issue, can be just as biased and close-minded as the people on the other side of that issue who disagree with us. In this video, I'll be giving an overview of the moral argument for the existence of God. But before I get into it, I would just ask that if you like the video, click the like button. And if you really like the video, you can subscribe to keep up with my newest videos. So, with that said, let's get into the video. I recently made a couple videos on the problem of evil, along with my thoughts on the argument, but I didn't get the chance to go over a very common objection to the argument, which is this. The argument points to all the evil in the world to try and disprove or make improbable the existence of God. But can there even be such a thing as evil if there is no God? Certainly, pretty much everyone agrees that the Holocaust was evil. But if you reject the existence of God, a kind of lawgiver, then on what basis, on what grounds can you say that the Holocaust, or any kind of evil in general, was or is really, truly, objectively evil? This objection essentially boils down to the claim that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist, which just so happens to be the first premise of the moral argument. The moral argument goes as follows. Premise 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists. Let's get some definitions straight here. First of all, the word God in the argument simply refers to a maximally great being, or in other words, just a generic God of classical theism. It doesn't refer to any particular specific God, like the Christian God or the Muslim God or whatnot. It just refers to a generic classical theistic God. Second, to quote William Lane Craig, to say there are objective moral values is to say that something is right or wrong independent of whether anyone believes it to be so. I know people often criticize proponents of the moral argument for being ambiguous on what they mean by the word objective, so I thought I'd just clear that up right away. Now, before I get into a defense of the first premise, let me make some more clarifications. Here is what the argument is not saying. The argument is not saying that you need to believe in God in order to be a good person. The argument is also not saying that you need to believe in God in order to figure out what is right and what is wrong. Atheists can obviously know what is right or wrong and live just as morally as theists, and in fact, many times much, much better than theists. The first premise is about the foundation for morality. It's about where moral values and duties stem from. So, what reason is there for thinking the first premise, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist, is true? It seems the primary reason for thinking this way is that on atheism, humans don't have any kind of intrinsic value. We are quite literally the byproduct of nature. We have just as much inherent value as other byproducts of nature, like bugs or rocks. Now, an existentialist thinker might respond by saying, well, yeah, it's true that there's no kind of ultimate, absolute, binding morality, but nevertheless, we can decide for ourselves how we think we should live. But this is essentially to just concede the point. This is to say that morality is subjective, dependent on human opinion. Even if we move to society as a whole, it's still completely subjective. To see the problem this presents, let me give you a thought experiment straight from William Lane Craig. Imagine that during World War II, the Allies failed to defeat the Axis powers. Imagine that Nazi Germany won the war and proceeded to brainwash absolutely everybody in the world to believe that Nazism was morally good, that killing Jews and other inferior people was morally good. On what basis could you possibly affirm that, as a matter of fact, Nazism is objectively morally bad? But this response is obviously inadequate, and it just completely misses the point. Why is hurting and killing these people morally bad? You can't appeal to some intrinsic or inherent value that humans have, because on atheism, humans don't have intrinsic or inherent value. And the moment you say that humans have value because we place value on them is, again, just to concede that this whole moral paradigm is ultimately subjective. Something is good or bad because we say it's good or bad. People have value because we say people have value. God's nature is inherently, necessarily good, and it's precisely this nature that provides the standard against which we can say that certain things are objectively good or bad. Now, it's important to note here that I'm not begging the question and prematurely asserting that God exists and that he's the source for objective morality. I'm simply saying that if God did exist, then we would have a good foundation on which to affirm objective morality. What about the second premise then? That objective moral values and duties do exist. So far, I've been generally supportive of the arguments for the existence of God, but this one is a little bit different because I think the reasons for believing premise 2 are a little bit shaky. The typical line of reasoning given to support premise 2 is that our experience confirms its truth. That is, we all have an experience that some things really are morally good and other things really are morally bad. And not just because we say they are, but because they actually objectively are good and bad. As the atheist Sam Harris has said, if we found out that there was a man who is cutting off the genitalia of terrified little girls and then sewing them back up, our only question would be how severely that man should be punished. This is definitely true, but the crucial problem here is whether our moral experience is reflective of some objective reality or if it's merely a result of sociobiological conditioning. Perhaps this moral sense was instilled in us through the process of evolution, leading us to value things that help the perpetuation of our species and devalue things which hinder the perpetuation of our species. The fact that we all have moral experience is consistent with both explanations, and there's still no rational reason to prefer one explanation over the other. Many people have responded to this line of thinking by pointing out the similarity between belief in objective morality and belief in the external world, the physical, objective world. How do we know we aren't just a brain in a vat, being stimulated by a mad scientist to give us the illusion of the outside world? There's nothing we can possibly point to prove the existence of the objective world. Anything that we point to could just as well be a result of the scientist's stimulation of our brain. But we all accept that the objective world really exists. And even further than that, we find it crazy to doubt the existence of the objective world. It's so crazy that some people who don't really concern themselves much with philosophy might actually not understand what you're telling them when you say that the objective world might not exist. It's that certain. Similarly, we all have this experience that certain things really, truly are morally good or morally bad. The idea that rape is morally bad seems just as certain as the idea that this room I'm in really exists. Now, you might object and say it's not true that absolutely everyone has this experience of some kind of moral sense. What about psychopaths and sociopaths, for example, who just have absolutely no empathy? But this seems to me like the equivalent of arguing that because there are blind people in the world, therefore we have some doubt about whether physical objects actually have visual properties to them. In both cases, there's an impairment. The psychopath is impaired in some way. The blind person is impaired. Now, I like this line of reasoning. I pretty much wholeheartedly agree with it. But the thing that still annoys me is that it still doesn't do anything to prove that objective moral values and duties really exist. It simply says that if experience is enough to make you accept the reality of the external world, then it should also be enough to make you accept the reality of objective morality. I'm not necessarily saying that this premise needs more support in order to be a reasonable premise. I just wish there was some kind of philosophical argument that led directly to the conclusion, therefore, objective moral values and duties exist. I mean, you could make an argument that because God exists, therefore objective moral values and duties exist, but in this context, that would just completely be question-begging because the existence of God is the thing we're trying to prove. Either way, I think that our moral experience can provide some support for the second premise. We certainly do experience moral truths as being objectively true. I just think it's up for debate how much support this gives for the second premise. Ultimately, I do believe that if you accept the existence of objective moral values and duties, then it follows that atheism is false, because atheism can't provide a proper account for objective moral values and duties. But it might be the case that we can only firmly establish morality as objective if we already believe that God exists. But if that's the case, then the argument can't possibly work because it would become question-begging. So, that is all for this video. I hope to have given a fair overview of the moral argument for the existence of God. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to share it with someone you know, and subscribe to keep up with my newest videos. If you feel like you have something to say, then undoubtedly leave it in the comments. If you have objections, leave them in the comments. I love reading comments. In my next video, I'll be responding to a video made by the YouTuber Rationality Rules, in which he lays out some objections to the moral argument, and I'll be diving a bit deeper into the topics he opens up. So, stay tuned for that video, and I'll see you then.